This afternoon, I'm happy to introduce Jack Marck, presenting Emerging Technologies for Agronomy. Jack Marck is the Managing Director for the Illinois Ag Tech Accelerator and has experience as a marketing brand manager and product manager. Jack has devoted a career to finding and exploring opportunities for improvement and optimization by overlapping rich data insights and analytics with expert intuition gathered from industry leaders. This presentation will survey emerging trends, agronomic tools, and a close examination of promising technologies for collecting, managing, and leveraging agronomic data for row crop production. Please help me welcome Jack to the 2022 Soybean Summit.
Thank you. Great. All right. So I'm going to approach this perhaps from a slightly different angle, and Jennifer kind of mentioned this in a little bit about my background. One of the things she did not say that I was a farmer, because I'm not. So what I do really enjoy kind of wrapping my head around are data and technology problems. It doesn't take very long for me in a typical, backyard barbecue conversation to find out that there's not really a ton of other people that like wrapping their head around data problems. And so one of the things that I do enjoy doing is figuring out how to help people not have to deal with data problems, and that's where the technology piece comes in. So one of the first things that I kind of want to jump into so that you understand a little bit more about my background and hopefully kind of understand the perspective that I come through, that I come to approach this with is sort of where I work. So the Illinois Ag Tech Accelerator works with early stage startups to accelerate their growth, and we run 2 programs a year. We run 5 companies per program, so we work with 10 companies per year. And we define the startup, actually really love this definition. Most of the time when I kind of like level set with people about what I mean by a startup, they're kind of hearing it for the first time or thinking about it in that definition for the first time, but it really hit me when I was reading through this for the 1,000th time. We define a startup, or we sort of embrace the definition that Eric Ries suggests, which is a startup is a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And thinking about it through the lens of what I'm going to talk about today, I was kind of like, well, that's basically what every farmer does looking into the next season, is going to try to produce a crop under conditions of extreme uncertainty, because there's a lot of factors that affect the viability of your business and what happens over the course of a growing season that you don't have control over. And so there's actually, I don't know, there's a ton of similarities between startups and farmers after that, but there's actually quite a bit of overlap. So just a little bit more about the data that we see, and I'll try not to use that word too much because I'm kind of tired of using it. But we look at, in the last 12 months, we've looked at 411 applications. We've conducted 327 interviews with startups. And we've picked, like I mentioned before, 10 startups that we've actually worked with very closely across a range of different topics in ag and livestock. I kind of took a breakdown of a subset of those 300 or 400 companies. I took a look at the top 3, and relevant for what we're talking about today, the top 3 topics that these companies are working on relevant to row crop are kind of divided up in their share of that top 3 in this pie chart. So 62% of those top 3 companies are working on various solutions for digital agronomy. We're going to take a look at a couple of them. Other areas that are actively being worked on include crop inputs. This has to do with things like biologicals. I'm sure everybody in this room has kind of seen hopefully some progress, but certainly a lot of activity. But other things as well that are not biological inputs. And then 15% around robotics and automation. Now, this is not just self-driving tractors. This has to do with any sort of automation around a grower's operation. So why do we pay attention? Why do I have a job? Really. And one of the reasons why is because the population, I'm sure everybody in this room has seen this quite a bit, the population is going to hit 9.7 billion by 2050. It's a 23% increase from where it is today. The other thing that we believe is that digitization is going to disrupt the consumer-producer dynamic. You guys are already quite familiar with that, I'm sure. Consumers telling producers, this is how we feel like you need to do things. And producers don't always necessarily have a good vehicle for providing their side of that story. There's also more opportunity for differentiation. As the volume of information about a producer's operation becomes more available and again through data. The ability to market what you do based on this volume of documentation that you'll have, which consists of the data that you have on your operation, gives you the ability to differentiate what you do and take credit for it. The other thing that we're noticing is that grower time resources are constrained and grower profitability is strained. So there are agronomic implications to each of these 5 points. The growing population, this means that new practices have to be more or less yield neutral. It's not really practical if we're talking about a 23% increase in the world population to recommend practices to growers that reduce their yield. That math doesn't work, moving things in opposite directions. It also means that net changes should be yield positive. So that means if you institute a new process that's yield neutral, that still doesn't move us any closer to feeding a population that's going to grow by 23%. So there have to be practices that are made available and technologies that become available to farmers that allow them to increase their yield, because there's also not going to be a 23% increase in farmland in the next 30 years. I don't think anybody really sees that on the horizon. So, and then this has to be evidenced by trials. This can't be just something that somebody thinks is a good idea because it was what they spent their graduate years on. It's got to be actually trialed out, and there has to be evidence for it. With regard to ag digitization, data security, and privacy, I think every single conversation I've had with a grower about their data, privacy comes up. So that has to be part of the equation. It needs to be integrated with farm management systems and precision ag software. The idea, the concept, and this is not just growers, the idea in technology that anybody is going to take the volume of data that goes through a grower's system and that person is going to then become an IT professional that figures out where it goes, how it has to be mutated, so that it works with everything else, that can't be part of the expectation here. There has to be a baseline understanding that, and this is kind of where automation comes in, that something is communicating between the various systems that you work with on a daily basis to make sure that they are working in synergy with each other. And bidirectional transparency is a big part of the digitization of ag. Bidirectional transparency means that instead of everybody being very transparent about the expectations that they expect farmers to adopt, that transparency also flows the other way. That means that all of the net positive practices that growers are already embracing, that information is also going back the other way, so that the consumer is informed that growers do, in fact, want to feed the world and not poison everybody. In terms of differentiation, this is actually something that I would say we're at the very, just based on the conversations that I've had with people, I would say we're kind of on the earlier edge of this. The agronomic practices that you implement on your farm give you the ability to differentiate various aspects besides just how much of a crop you grow. So depending on who the end consumer is for, whether it's soybeans or corn or what have you, there are other parameters that we're now able to test for in terms of the nutritional say cross-section of a particular crop that may make it more marketable to people who are looking for particular traits at a nutritional level, whether that's for feed or human consumption. And the ability for you to modify agronomic practices in order to favor a particular variety or a particular trait should make that particular grain more marketable and charge a premium for it to reward you for what are likely more costly and labor-intensive practices. Data plays an important part in that, both on the management, on the input management side of things, as well as on the actual end product analysis. Time constraints, I kind of touched on this a little bit before. Any new technology that gets pushed to a grower has to be easy to use. It should really be automated. You should barely know that it's there. And it has to be net neutral. Really, it should be positive, honestly. I mean, anything that requires an incremental use of your time is really questionable. Now you have to balance that with something else you're not going to be able to do. And then in terms of profitability, it has to be practical. Right? This can't be something that costs you money to do because somebody else said that you should do it. So we're going to take a look at, and I forgot to update this slide, 4 examples, actually, of some companies that we've seen that are in the startup space that are impacting what the future of agronomy might look like. The first one I'm going to highlight, because they're practically next door, is a company called Earthsense. So referring back to those 5 areas that I had mentioned before, the area and this is, a lot of this is my opinion, but the area that I see Earthsense impacting is around the digitization and as well as time constraints, because they're allowing an enormous amount of data, so that's the digitization piece, to be collected autonomously by a roving robot. And that's allowing a larger volume of data to come in with very little human supervision, and is primarily targeting seed breeders. Their value proposition, and I kind of alluded to this just a moment ago, is deep under canopy field data and trait analytics for a seed breeders program. So I'm going to pause for a second because I don't know that very many of you are seed breeders, so why is this relevant to you? Part of this, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later in the second half of this presentation, it has to do with who sees the most risk and the most reward for adopting a new technology. So if you were to adopt a technology like this on a typical farm, this might help you optimize for 1 season's worth of a crop. But for a seed breeder, this represents the next iteration of an entire seed brand, essentially, an entire seed portfolio of genetics. So what that means is that they have a bigger budget, basically, to play with in terms of being able to collect more research and optimize their breeding program. So we see certain sectors within ag being sort of the earliest adopters of these new technologies. Does that mean it makes sense for you today? Quite frankly, probably not. Does it make sense for you in 3 to 5 years? Maybe. 5 to 10 years? Probably some version of this, quite possibly. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that synergy works to create a more cohesive strategy that may not make as much sense today as it will in a few years. So the next company that I want to mention is probably the one that I talked to a few times, and then finally the light bulb went off, and so I'm actually pretty excited about what this company is working on. They're impacting the areas of digitization and time constraints, again, currently working with seed breeders. Their value proposition is hands-free data entry. Now, if you think about the adoption of technology in other industries outside of ag, because I feel like sometimes the ag industry is kind of this whipping boy for how slow everyone has been to adopt technology. When you look at other professions where technology has been embraced a little bit faster, they went from sitting at a desk working with a piece of paper and a pen and a calculator to sitting at a desk working at a laptop. That's not what a day in the life of a grower ever was. There was a certain amount of sitting at a desk, certainly, but not the full-time job. And so I think where we really see an increased rate in the adoption of technology is when the technology that a farmer is supposed to be adopting fit in their pocket. In fact, I've talked to several growers who never had a personal computer. They just went straight to a smartphone because that was the only way that it made sense. It was something that they could carry with them. So it didn't mean going back home at the end of a day and spending a couple of hours putting information into a computer. What AgVoice is doing is taking that one step further. You can now put that data in. You can now interface with this technology using just your voice. And as you can see, this is an actual example. I don't have a video of it, but this is an actual sort of animation, if you will, of an actual use case of a seed breeder inspecting an ear of corn with both hands while entering data into their tracking system. So I expect, and again, this is just my opinion, but I expect that this technology represents a major disruption in terms of how ag professionals are able to interact with technology. Sensagrass, the area that this startup is impacting, the impact that I see them having is around the ability to feed the growing population. What they're working on is an IoT soil analysis device that provides soil analytics in real time. And they're also working on agronomic recommendations. Now, the idea of being able to speed up the feedback loop for a soil sample, currently I think industry standard is somewhere between 7 to 10 days, taking the sample, sending it to a lab, getting data back. This is something that an agronomist would be able to do in the field in real time. So what that means is you could get a soil analysis in a day and work with an agronomist to generate a prescription or a plan for the rest of the season within a couple of days. And I think that's a pretty significant, making the most of the time that's available. I think being able to shorten the lead time for some of these things is pretty important. The agronomic recommendations piece of things, I think this is something that, and I mentioned this before about the importance of having trial data. That's something that I think is valuable so long as there is still an experienced ag professional, agronomist, who can sort of run interference on that to ensure that the recommendation that the computer is making is still viable. And this is really where I think the future in the near term of artificial intelligence is actually extremely beneficial. This idea of going straight from working with an agronomist who you've probably known your entire life to talking to a computer, that's not really how this is going to work. Any more than cars went straight from having carburetors to being fully electric and driving themselves. We still don't have that. What we do have are some helpful technologies that will nudge you if you start to leave your lane, or slow down if you have your cruise control on and you get too close to the car in front of you. They're not taking the steering wheel out of your hands any more than a recommendation engine like this is going to replace your agronomist. That's my prediction. And then the last company that I think is not flashy at all, but is positioned to play a really outsized role in making technology more accessible, more practical and more useful, is leaf agriculture. They're playing in the way back end of the digitization space. And put quite simply, without any technical jargon, they're essentially standardizing the way that ag data flows through multiple farm management systems and software platforms in agriculture. What that means is you don't have to put your data in 5,000 times across every single different ag software that you use. Companies that choose to implement this protocol, implement this technology, will be able to mesh your data from various sources while keeping you in control of what systems you decide to link. I may have said they were the last one. They're not. There is actually one more. Top yield is impacting, I see this impacting the area of digitization. Their current users are ag professionals, especially growers. So this is a technology where you could go home, you could go to topyield.ag, sign up for it today. And what this platform is trying to do is to connect growers across geographies to facilitate the sharing of information. Now, this may not sound like a novel thought because this is already being done on Twitter. It's also being done in Ag Talk. It's being done in Facebook groups. But what this platform does a little bit differently is it's really heavy on the agronomic question and answer and exchange of information to help make sure that growers are informed, educated, and are confident about what they're doing. Okay, so this is where I kind of shift gears a little bit because I think what I want to make sure that everyone in the room is able to leave with is some piece of actionable information that you can take back to your farm, and hopefully this has an impact on what you do. Okay, so what I don't have is any pithy agronomic advice that'll triple your year next year. I can't do that. So, but what I do think is valuable is as you kind of look at what ag is evolving into, what are some resources that you can use to, first of all, stay informed, and second of all, most importantly, to be involved? Because the technologies that get traction should be informed by the growers that they're intending to serve. And what that means is that some grower somewhere has to engage with them, try them, and provide feedback as to whether or not it's even viable. There is some risk that's involved in that. And so I've kind of stolen this curve that some of you have possibly seen before, where they'll talk about this as the tech adoption curve. I kind of want to put a different spin on this because I feel like a lot of times people try to bucket like people on this curve. Are you an early adopter? Are you an innovator? And what's funny is, even looking at this and reflecting on my own history of tech adoption, if you will, I had a smartphone. I was on my second or third smartphone by the time the iPhone first came out. So I was an early adopter of smartphones. We don't have an Alexa in my house. And that's not because I hate technology. It's because I really don't like the idea of yelling at a light switch more than once to get it to come on. And my in-laws that have an Alexa have done that. So I've never had to yell at a light switch in my life. And I kind of like that. So does that mean that I'm way over here on the other side of laggard and I hate technology? Not at all. I have lots of evidence to the contrary. But it does mean that there's a limit to what frustration I'm willing to put up with, even though it doesn't always make sense. So when you're thinking about whether or not a particular technology is worth your time to investigate or learn more about, I think there are 4 priorities that are useful to kind of think about. And if I start to sound a little bit like your retirement finance advisor, it's because there's actually a lot of overlap between the psychology that goes behind this kind of thinking and constructing a retirement portfolio or any other investment portfolio. How important is your time? And do you have any spare? Because if somebody comes to you with an idea that requires, it's a great idea, but it requires 10 extra hours a week, and you don't have 10 extra hours a week, then it's already frustrating. So try not to get involved in partnerships that are just going to be frustrating from the get-go. So how important is your time? Do you have any room in terms of profitability? Do you have some extra money to potentially throw at an experiment? Or, more likely, if it's an early stage company, they may work with you at no charge, but there's still the risk of reduced profit or something along those lines if things don't go well, and they might not. How important is differentiation? Right now, this is probably not a major factor, but I do see that changing in the next 5 to 10 years, and so this may be something that you want to start thinking about, how you might be able to differentiate your crop beyond just what you're doing currently. And then traceability is a really important one, because this is something that is not going away. The consumer is getting more and more curious about where their food comes from and how it's grown. So keeping that a secret is not a valuable long-term strategy. Being able to manage that to tell the best possible story is well within your power. So if you come across a technology that helps you do that, and this is something that's important to you, it might be worth taking a look at. So as you come across these companies, or as you go out looking for them, which I would encourage you to do, and I've got some resources for that I'll talk about in a second, there's a vetting process that's actually very similar to our process I had mentioned before. I think for our last program, we had 267 applicants. We had to whittle it down to 5 over the course of a few rounds of interviews. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of how we look at ag tech startups that we feel like are worth our time and represent a valuable impact on agriculture. We take a look at their other partnerships. Who are your friends? Right? Have you managed to talk anybody else into this? Or am I the first one? Because that has an impact on the risk. What evidence do you have? What other trials have you tried this technology on, or how else have you seen this applied or implemented? And then the last 2 things are things that I don't know are always necessarily when you're thinking about an ROI calculation and things like that. I think one of the things that's also very important is the team that's building the technology and their motivation. And the best technologies that I've seen that are trying to make a change, that are trying to change the way growers do things, are doing it because they're motivated by making the grower's life better and having a positive impact potentially in other areas. So they are sensitive to the pain points of their end user, which in many cases is the grower. That motivation means that even if they get the first thing wrong, when they adjust and they make an improvement, their true north or whatever is in a direction that makes sense. I oftentimes will explain to people that when we look at the team that's building a technology, you can have a really good team that's smart enough to pivot away from a bad technology, but a bad team will ruin a good technology. And it'll make a bad technology worse. So it's really important that whoever you're working with has a really good vision, and that your vision and their vision are at least somewhat aligned. And then the last thing, trust your gut. If you're going to end up having to talk to this person on a regular basis or work with this company on an ongoing basis, it needs to be somebody that you don't loathe the idea of answering their phone calls or talking to them. Good vibes are important. Okay, so in terms of sourcing, obviously, I have an opinion on the value of accelerators since I work at one. But in all practicality, I mentioned before, we've sorted through, just in this last application cycle, 267 applications from around the world, and whittled it down to 5. So and we're not the only one. There are accelerators in North Dakota. There's accelerators there's one based out of Memphis that's really good. There are several, and these are ag-focused accelerators. So the whole purpose of an accelerator is to filter down to technologies that they think are valuable, invest in them, and help them grow. So you can kind of piggyback off of that vetting process, find companies, find startups that have already completed an accelerator program or enrolled in an accelerator program, because that means that somebody else besides you has already looked at them and decided that they've got some value. So take it with a grain of salt, but at least then you know that you're not the first person to evaluate. Newsletters are also a really valuable, source of information. So whether those are various news articles, I'm sure you've all seen in various ag-related periodicals, headlines and articles, whatever, about emerging startups. So they may be something where if you haven't paid attention to that as much in the past, it might be worth paying some attention to. And then associations, right? Illinois Soybean Association invited me here to talk to you. So you've learned a little bit about it. Hopefully it wasn't a total waste of time. And the associations that you're a member of can also be a really good source. I've seen several of them actually, because I've talked to a few of them that are really interested in trying to develop a sort of platform that helps bring promising startups that have already gone through a vetting process to their members. And so I think that's a valuable thing that's being done, and something that you can reach out to your representative about and see if an existing program like that exists, where that would help you stay kind of dialed into what's going on. Okay, so I've pushed a lot of information, and to be honest with you, and I kind of said this before, we operate, we come at this from the perspective, at the Accelerator, come at this from the perspective of some of the things that we think matter to the industry, to growers, and then also making sure that the consumer is well connected to the grower in a positive way. But I'd be very interested in if anybody has had experience working with emerging technologies, how that went, if you have any advice, good, bad, whatever. I'll open up for questions if that's all right. Thank you.